Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today. Welcome back to our journey through Mark. Today, we will be looking at Mark chapter 8, verse 11 to 26. And before we continue, I would like to request you to like and subscribe wherever you're watching these from, whether it's Facebook, please like us. If it's on YouTube, like and subscribe as well, or whether you're listening on Anchor, we would love as well to hear from you. So leave a comment, let us know, and browse through and see what you can find. There is something for everybody. With that being said, let's jump right into the book of Mark, chapter 8, verse 11 to 26. This is what it says from the NIV. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." They discussed these with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" They answered, 7. He said to them, "Do you still not understand?" Verse 22, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, and his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go to the village." That's the word of the Lord. Praise be to God. Today, we will be looking at 3 events that beg just one question. And that question is a question for us as well. Do you still not understand? We will be looking at a bird's eye view from way high up in the air of spiritual blindness. Whether it's permanent like the Pharisees or temporary like the disciples, it is a universal condition. Light is all around us, but we cannot appreciate it without open eyes. Here we find hard hearts, ignorant minds, and darkened understanding. Looking at verses 11 through 13, which is where we will start. We see Pharisees coming to question Jesus, and Matthew's account adds that the Sadducees were there as well. So Jesus has just come from the other side of the lake, and he's come back to his home area where he had grown up. And this is a kind of welcome he gets. Specifically, they're asking for a sign from heaven. This is an attempt to discredit Jesus, which begs the question, had they not seen the signs? And this is where we find Jesus sighing deeply, because spiritual blindness affects him. Why does it affect him? Because he cares that none of us should be lost. And what does he tell them? No sign will be given to this generation. Then we find that it says, leaving them. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. He just arrives, they ask for a sign. He tells them no sign will be given, gets on the boat, crosses to the other side. And with this, it ends Jesus' final conflict with the Jewish leaders and their followers in Galilee. This is the last time they will face the Savior. After this, he will be their judge from this point on. No more invitations. And from this point on, his displays of power will be for those who believe. Their door is shut. Do you remember Nicodemus' testimony? He was a Pharisee. So that is the permanent spiritual blindness. And moving on swiftly, let's look at temporary spiritual blindness, which is found starting on verse 14. And we find this from the disciples. They had forgotten to bring food, or to bring bread rather, except for one loaf. Food is on their mind. But at least they followed the rejected Lord. They got in the boat with him. And in verse 15, Jesus is warning them. He's giving serious warning. He's giving them orders. He tells them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Matthew adds, beware of the Sadducees as well. In other words, beware of influential people. Pharisees were legalists. Sadducees were liberals. Beware of all types of influence. Yeast or leaven permeates and affects the structure of the dough by bacterial corruption, just like sin does to us. And the ever-caring Jesus warns and protects them. He warns his own. And then verse 16, they discuss with one another and say, it's because we have no bread. That's why he's talking about this. He knows we have no bread. Well, that sank in. That sank in, did it? No, nothing sank. They missed the meaning completely. All they had was stick with the flat bread, not the leavened one. Then we see the patience of the Lord towards those who believe, in contrast to the ones who don't believe. In verses 17 and 18, he's aware of their discussion. And here we see his patience. They are conducted to a greater light, unlike the other bunch that was condemned to eternal darkness. He asked them, do you get it? Or do you still not get it? Don't you remember? Do you have eyes but fail to see, ears but fail to hear? Here we find some ordinary men face to face with an extraordinary God who loves them and expounds things. And how does he do that? Verses 19 to 21, he calls to remembrance he tells them, remember how I have provided for you. And he says, when I broke bread for 5,000, how many basketfuls? And when I broke for 4,000, how many basketfuls? They remembered. They're the ones who answered how many basketfuls each time. Are you still worried about lunch? Or do you get into a situation that seems so big that you forget the past victories? God has been faithful in the past. He is faithful today, and he will be faithful in the future. As Paul says in Timothy, if we become faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Matthew's account adds that then they understood what he meant. That was a light bulb moment for them. So we see two kinds of blindness. Spiritually speaking, we have permanent and we have temporary. The question is, what's the cure for this blindness? And I'm glad you asked. So introducing, drumroll please, the last section for today, which is verses 22 to 26. This is one of the two miracles found only in Mark. This one and the one about the deaf and mute man. And this is the last miracle in Galilee that's recorded by Mark. So, verse 22, they came to Bethsaida, house of fishing. That's what Bethsaida means. It's technically still Galilee, but it's the tetrarchy of Herod Philip. There is some Roman influence there, but they're still very familiar with Jesus. This is near where the 5,000 were fed. So in that backdrop, we look at verse 23, where after verse 22, some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. In verse 23, he took the blind man by the hand, the caring hand of the Savior, and led him outside the village. Why did he lead him outside the village? No more public displays here. He takes him by the hand, leads him outside the village. The other thing I find peculiar is the spitting and the laying of the hands. Was there anything attached to these? Were they just theatrics? Were there some rituals behind it? I don't know. It's definitely unconventional. But Jesus did not want to be boxed into one way of curing. Sometimes he could cure virtually from a long distance. Sometimes he would touch someone. Here he does something extra. But what we know is that he heals him. And then he asks him, do you see anything? This is the only time he asks the healed person a question. And it's the only two-stage miracle we see in the ministry of Jesus. And it's not a crusade. He's not interviewing the man. Remember, they're in a remote place outside the village. Or rather, it's more of a private setting. In verse 24, the man says, I see people. They look like trees walking around. How did he know how trees look like? I don't know. What we know is that he has imperfect sight. And then verse 25, once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. One more time, Lord, I need your touch. You know that song? And this time, his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly, complete, perfect sight, 20/20 vision instantaneously. And then verse 26, Jesus sent him home saying, don't even go into the village. Go home. Go home. Now, did this one obey? I don't know. But here we find Jesus launching Act 2 of his ministry. He's going away from public service to private teaching as he heads towards the cross. So as we conclude and as we bring this home, the question for you and I is, do you see anything? Sometimes, like the disciples, they're hearing the words, but they're not understanding it. Like this blind man, he could see men, but they look like trees. What is blinding you from seeing perfectly? What is preventing you from understanding? If the Savior asks you, do you understand now? The other question we can ask ourselves is, are you measuring on the minors? Am I measuring on the minors? The disciples have been blind, but they stayed at the source of the light, unlike the Pharisees. And this is the difference between clarity from the Lord or condemnation from the righteous judge. This will lead up to the great confession that we will see during our next lesson in the journey through Mark. But for now, let's make this our prayer. One more time, Lord, I need your touch. We all need the touch of the Savior to open our eyes that we may see clearly. Thank you so much. God bless you. And we will see you next time as we continue on the journey through Mark. God bless. Bye.